Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us online. We're just going to wait a few more minutes to see if anyone else trickles in online or in person. Okay, thanks for your patience. We're going to go ahead and get started. So we have a pretty simple agenda for tonight. We're going to spend a little bit of time in the beginning just giving a presentation that covers, the broad basics of the ordinance, the screening process, and also the permitting and retrofit process. And then the majority of our time tonight is going to be left open for Q&A, so we'll really have a lot of time to answer your questions and dive into any of the details you're interested in. There is a Q&A feature in the webinar, so you can fill in questions while we're going if you'd like, or wait till the end. We'll be able to see them. And then at the end, you can also either raise your hand on the Zoom feature if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll also be able to have questions from those who are here in person. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. I'll start off just with a quick introduction. My name is Michelle Plaus. I'm the Community Development Analyst, and I'm kind of the main administrator of our soft story retrofit ordinance. If you've been talking to somebody at city staff about this, it was probably me. So I've been working a lot on the logistics of getting the screenings done for everyone. I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Bond here.
Hi, I'm Jeff Bond. I'm the Community Development Director. And Michelle and I have been working together on this for a few years. We're anxious to make sure this program is working for everybody and get these buildings retrofitted so that you have a real estate asset that continues to function after, unfortunately, the inevitable earthquakes that we will see in our future, and keeps our community together. So with that, I'll toss it back to Michelle.
Okay, let me bring up my slides here. Okay. All right. So, as you all saw in your letter probably, and know since you're here, the City of Albany last year passed a soft story retrofit ordinance. This ordinance requires buildings with soft stories or wood frame target stories, as they're also called, to receive seismic retrofits. And I think the best place to start with that is, what in the world is a soft story building? Which is a question I've been getting a lot of. It's a little bit of a confusing and strange concept. There's some engineering stuff and all those confusing things, but really it's a fairly simple thing when you get down to it. It's a building where one of the stories, usually the first story, is significantly weaker in an earthquake than the stories above it. So, it's particularly dangerous in that situation, and you might have a collapse or damage to the building that makes it uninhabitable, things that we don't want to see in a major earthquake. There's a lot of reasons that you might have a soft story building. Some of the most common that we see are if you have a lot of garage door openings or a very large garage door opening on that first floor. In a lot of cases, you end up with essentially pillars holding up one side of the wall. And as you can imagine, that's much less strong and stable than an entire wall would be. And so in a large earthquake, you can get a situation like this where it's sort of leaning to the side and crumbling underneath itself a bit. You might also see buildings that have really large windows, for instance, in a retail shop. Sometimes in a hillside building, you'll have the situation where the downhill floor has, less wall area, or the walls are not quite as strong for one reason or another. And in some cases, you'll actually have a cripple wall situation where it's not even a full floor, it's a smaller underfloor area that, again, has, less strength in the walls and can cause the building to kind of slide sideways. So there's a variety of reasons you might have a soft story building. The technical name is wood frame target story. They essentially mean the same thing, but wood frame target story does clarify that we're talking about situations where we have wood framing. That's really what we're looking at this program. So the basics of the ordinance are that these soft story buildings are required to get a retrofit to make them much safer in the case of an earthquake. And specifically, it's for buildings that have 3 or more units, were built before 1981, and have that soft story or wood frame target story. So buildings that have all 3 of those components are required to retrofit. And just an overview of the whole process here on this right side of the slide. The program launched in December of last year, and notice letters were sent out to building owners that could be one of those buildings required to retrofit. So anyone on our list that had 3 or more units and were built before 1981, we sent out letters to everyone, and all of those building owners need to screen the buildings. That screening phase took place up until October 15th of this year when the deadline passed, although I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And basically that screening phase determines whether each building does need a retrofit or does not. Those that are exempt get out of the program, they're done, no more steps. And those that do need to retrofit move into the next phase where they have to get permits and then complete those retrofits. And the deadlines can vary depending on what tier they're placed in, which has to do with some components of the building we'll talk about in a moment. I will note, that screening phase deadline did pass. However, if you didn't finish your screening yet, we will move you into whatever the correct spot is for your building once you complete that screening. So if your building should be exempt and you complete the screening that shows that, your building will be exempt. So the deadline has passed, but we are still accepting screenings, and we want to make sure that all buildings are screened correctly. So speaking of, let's talk about the screening process itself. I'm going to go over the most basic form, the most common form of the screening. And the really most essential piece of this is that in most cases, a licensed architect or engineer is required to complete the screening. Whether or not a building is a soft story is, a bit technical to actually determine. That's not something that we expect or want building owners to determine. It's not something that even we as staff can necessarily determine. This is something that a trained professional should be looking at. So they're going to be really essential to complete the screening of your building. We do have some lists available online at our website, albanyca.org/softstory. So you can go there and take a look to find some engineers to come and help you. You can also just use Google. Anyone you like is fine as long as they have a license. And that engineer or architect will come out and inspect your property, and they will determine whether or not it has a soft story, and they'll help you complete that screening form. And then you can submit this form either by mail, email, or using our online form. And just make sure you complete one form for each building. So if you have maybe a property that has 2 or 3 separate buildings, you want to complete a form for each one of those. So that's the essentials of the screening process. There are a few alternatives and exceptions that I'm going to talk about for particular cases. So on the left here, you can see the the meatiest part of our screening form with the kind of all the questions that you have to figure out answers to. The first 2 questions are the sort of simpler ones related to whether or not your building is a subject building. So whether it was constructed or permitted before 1981, and whether it contains 3 or more dwelling units. Those are questions that a building owner probably has the answer to. And if the answer to either of those is no, then your building's going to be exempt. So you could mark no on one of those questions and then just skip down to the very bottom of the form and sign. For instance, you might have a building that it says 3 units on our data, but it's actually 2 buildings, one with 1 unit and one with 2. You could fill out 2 forms and mark no on that question for each of them and skip to the end without an engineer. So there will be some buildings where that's the case. And then there might be a few cases also for number 3, this big question about whether it has a wood frame target story or a soft story. If you know for absolute certain that your building does have a soft story, maybe you've had an engineer come in the past and tell you that, or it was disclosed when you bought the building or something, if you know for sure, you can mark yes on your own and not get an engineer to sign off. If you do that, you will be required to retrofit, but that is a possibility if you know that's what's happening with your building and you don't want to spend all the time getting the engineer to come and confirm it. So that's another alternative. And then for these last 3 questions, just a couple of notes. If your building has already undergone a seismic retrofit, maybe it is a soft story and you had a soft story retrofit a few years ago voluntarily, you can mark yes on this question. And we have a second form that we'll do to make sure that it's a complete retrofit and that it meets all of our standards. And if it does, then you're all set. We don't want to make you get 2 retrofits for no reason. So there's kind of a secondary process to check on that retrofit. And then these last 2 questions are actually just to determine which tier your building will be placed in and what deadlines you'll have to follow. These questions only need to be answered if you've said yes to those top 3 questions and your building is required to retrofit. Then you'll have to fill out these next 2 to determine your tier. But if you answered, for instance, no, my building only has 2 units, then you can just skip down to the end. So that's sort of the anatomy of this section. And now I'm just going to talk about one more alternative to the normal screening process. This is something we designed to be helpful to certain building owners that meet a specific requirement. So if your building has full height concrete walls on the ground story, you might be eligible for a building department screening. And that's where building department staff, would actually come out and inspect your building, and I can exempt you without the need of an engineer. So this, again, is just for buildings with concrete on the ground story. For instance, we have a lot of these here in Albany on the left, where you have these concrete masonry units. They look like kind of big concrete bricks. A lot of times it's surrounding the walls of a first floor parking lot. If that's your building, you're probably eligible for this building department screening. And we also have some buildings where there's an underfloor area that has a short, usually like 3 or 4 foot wall made of concrete. And when that concrete goes all the way up to the floor and there's no vertical wood framing, that is also eligible for the building department screening. And again, that's where the building staff, can come out and exempt your building for you after an inspection. Basically, I'm not an engineer, but I can determine the difference between wood and concrete. And so I'm able to say, yeah, that's not a wood frame target story, that is concrete, you're exempt. The way you do that is you send me a few photos of those concrete walls, and then I'll send you a scheduling program to make a time for the inspection. Again, that's optional, but just to make it easy for those buildings that do have concrete walls. And finally, we have the tiers and the timeline. So if your building does need to do a retrofit, you'll fall into one of our 4 tiers, depending on how many units your building has and whether or not you have a unit in the ground story. So you'll fall into one of these 4 tiers, and depending on your tier, you will have a deadline for receiving your building permit and for completing the retrofit construction. The earliest tier is a permit required in October of next year, and then the construction in 2026. And the latest tier requires the permit in 2028 and construction in 2029. So it's a bit spread out on what those deadlines are. And now I'm going to hand it over to Jeff to talk about the actual process of doing the retrofit and getting your permit.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. So you've gone through the screening process. You know you need to do a retrofit. What does all this mean? I think so, yep. There's usually 2 pretty simple steps that need to be taken. The first is using the example of the building on the left, where, as Michelle was saying, the little columns in the front are not very strong. You need to reinforce that. And so there's this steel bracing that you see on the right-hand side. There are different companies that make these products, and they're pretty simple and straightforward to install. And a structural engineer familiar with these products could specify exactly what it is, what the size needs to be, and how it's attached to the building, and how it's the footing for the foundation is constructed. So that's the primary way. You can go ahead, and then the other way for some buildings is to basically reinforce the wood walls underneath, not underneath, on the ground floor, with structural plywood and some stainless steel connectors that connect the wall and the foundation and this reinforcing plywood, so it's a stiffer, stronger wall than just, say, a series of 2x4s every 16 inches apart or something like that. So these are the 2 most common. The engineer, again, in just a few minutes can say, okay, you need one or the other, and they would, and you should find somebody who's familiar with doing this kind of work, and they can specify the details pretty quickly for you. Go ahead. I wanted to spend just a minute or 2 with kind of the process and maybe some tips on making the process of getting the permit as easy as possible. First, we will need to have a licensed engineer prepare the plans. In California, you have to have a license to be to practice engineering. So although, like I say, some of these things are pretty simple and your contractor might say, I know exactly what to do, we still need to have a licensed engineer prepare and approve the plans. And we do need to have a licensed contractor. Again, this is a state law that requires that contractors who are working on buildings like this do have a license with the state. So we follow those regulations. A friendly hint is inform your tenants sooner rather than later. It helps them manage their expectations. We get lots of calls from tenants of rental properties that are surprised because they wake up one morning and there's a bunch of work going on in their building, and gets people off on the wrong foot. So highly recommend that you reach out to your tenants early on, particularly if you're impacting their parking or their storage, sometimes their storage areas, the laundry room, et cetera, or just disturbing noise. So that's just a friendly tip. In terms of the application process, we encourage people to email plans in as much as possible. It's just a little bit easier for us. We're a small operation and we don't always have the person you need to talk to for details available at the counter for you. The kinds of things we're looking for is not complicated, but we do need to see a basic floor plan and an idea of what the existing structural condition of the building and what's proposed to be done. Those should be pretty easy to prepare. You may have already had some of those plans prepared for other work or received them when you purchased the property. The engineer will know all this. There'll be some basic structural calculations they'll need to provide. And if they're touching anything else in the course of the work, we'll want to see that too. So if you have to move some plumbing or electrical panel or HVAC systems or what have you, do show that on the plans as well. And again, we have an email permits, and this is all on our webpage, by the way, everything we're talking about. We have an email called permits@albanyca.org. You can email that in. There are several different people who are checking that routinely to schedule appointments, answer your questions, and so forth. Go ahead. So once you get the permit submitted to us, we'll review it as quickly as we can. It usually takes a few weeks. We have a consultant that will double check the work of your engineer, and then we will package all the material together. There's a bunch of paperwork that we have to do, unfortunately, so it does take a little bit of time. But once we issue the permit, you're ready to go. Again, please wait until we issue the permit before you start the work. That just helps us make sure that we're not making a change to your plans and that you don't know about yet, and then we have to go backwards. Again, communicate with your tenants. You'd be surprised how many times we get phone calls from upset tenants, and then we have to slow everything down and get it sorted out. And then you'll need to schedule inspections as the work is going on. A contractor will know when to schedule those inspections, but they're typically, for a relatively simple project, it might be just 2 or 3 inspections. Certainly want to look before any concrete is poured or any walls are closed up so that we can see the details of what the workmanship and make sure that the actual construction matches what's on the plans. Pretty easy in Albany to schedule an inspection. You can usually get in the next day or two, with the exception of holidays and stuff like that. But we're pretty good about getting inspections scheduled promptly. And yeah, back to Michelle for this one, I think.
Just want to talk briefly again about tenant displacement. So this isn't going to be particularly common. Usually these retrofits can be done without displacing any tenants. But we did build some tenant protection into the ordinance that it's important for everyone to know about. Tenants cannot be evicted due to required retrofit work, even if they have to temporarily vacate. So that's just an important thing to note. It can't be a cause for evicting a tenant. We also tried to make an effort to make the logistics a little bit easier by putting those buildings with units in the work area in the later tiers with later deadlines. And the idea there is to give you time to work with the tenants. Maybe if there's a tenant that's going to be moving out at a certain point, you can try to schedule the work in that time that the unit will be empty, or just kind of scheduling out in advance to make it easier for everyone. We also are considering, we will consider allowing work to be delayed if it will help avoid tenant displacement. If you have a tenant that's planning to move out in a few months, we can, push your deadline a little bit to make sure that it's easier for everyone. So we're trying to make sure that we work with you and the tenants to make this as painless for everyone as possible.
Another trick that might be helpful is if you have say a unit available in another part of the project, another part of your building, maybe you can move the tenant that would be displaced just into that vacant unit for the week or two that the work is going on. At least they've got, you can get a mattress and a suitcase and something up there. Just a possibility. So again, I think the most important thing is talk to us about these situations. We really want to try to accommodate everybody's needs, and we feel like we have the flexibility to do that to make it go smoothly for everybody.
Exactly. And speaking of extensions and exemptions, again, we're trying to be flexible and help people out. If there is a situation where you have, particular financial hardship, if you're, again, trying to avoid or minimize displacement for tenants, and also if, there's a situation such as with COVID when there were huge swings in price and shortages, or, if there's some sort of major issue like that, again, we're going to try to make sure that we're making this doable and not putting any sort of undue hardship on people. So if you are having any issues or concerns, come and talk to us and we can try to help out as much as possible.
One last caution to everybody is that while this is addressing a very important hazard in your buildings, it doesn't address every seismic hazard in your building. So there are still things that we're not looking at the electrical system, we're not looking at the gas lines. There are a lot of things we're not looking at, how different parts of the building are attached. We're just really focused on this one soft story. So do encourage you to think about the other aspects of your building to make sure it's livable for everyone after an earthquake.
Okay, great. So we're going to shift now into our questions section. Just so you know, this is being recorded and we'll post it online so you can rewatch and relook at the slides later on if you'd like. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And again, you can put questions into the Q&A box, and you can also raise your hand. And if you're here in person, you can also raise your hand.
So we have just a couple of people here in the room. Maybe we can start with them. If
Sure.
you two have any questions that you'd like, I have a.
Sorry. If you can talk into the mic so it's everyone can hear.
Just trying to find like a engineer or architect that the city familiar with, or at least familiar with the soft story requirements, so that we could reach out to them and have them help us like a guidance counselor. Hey, this is what you need to do. I mean, you could call someone from Google. It's like a bunch of scammer or, a big organization. We rather want to work with someone who familiar with Albany, familiar with you guys, how you guys operate, helping us out. So I know you say you have a list on the website, and I'll look into that. But that's my main concern is getting those group of people that guide us through this process.
I wish we could, but we're not in a position to recommend. We're not like, we don't track 5 stars or 2 stars for different people that work in the city. I do know that there is an association of property owners, and maybe talking with some of the other property owners in town that have had good experiences would be my recommendation. Like I said, we do have the list. We can't make recommendations. We'll put anybody on it, but. Ask around, ask for references, the usual thing.
Is an owner allowed to act as a contractor in this process?
According to state law, no. You can act as a project manager and help the contractor, but unless it was your primary home, you couldn't be able to do it. I'm sorry.
Okay, we've got a few questions in the Q&A that I'm going to go to, and then we've got a hand raised also. One question that came up was someone who was working on compliance with SB 721, which is also known as the 3E program, which, what does that stand for? Elevated exterior.
That's a little bit different thing. Exterior elevated elements.
Yes.
It's basically the balcony law.
Yeah, so this person is asking if that's separate from this soft story retrofit program, and the answer is yes. They are completely separate programs. They have nothing to do with one another. It's a bit unfortunate because they cover a lot of the same buildings and they sound kind of similar in some ways. So we've had some confusion about that, but these are completely separate programs. They talk about separate parts of your building. So if you've done something with the 3E program or you've been exempted or whatever, that doesn't relate at all to the soft story retrofit ordinance.
And I could answer some of the questions about that program later on, and also our webpage, city webpage under the building department does have a lot of information about that 3E program.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right, we do have a hand raised, so I'm going to hand it off to Colin Doyle. I'm going to allow you to talk. Please go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, can't see you now, but okay. My name is Colin Doyle. I'm an architect, and off your website under the retrofits category, it says generally retrofits can be completed either by installing blah blah blah. Okay, the retrofit must be completed by a licensed professional and comply with one of the three following standards. Well, the third one is for historic buildings, so that we won't qualify for that. The first two are Chapter A4 of the latest edition of the California Existing Building Code, and the second one is the latest edition of the Seismic Evaluation and Retrofit of Existing Buildings, ASC, blah, blah, blah. Neither of those are, the building code, the regular building code, which is what I'm familiar with. I'm wondering, are these two other ones that you mentioned, the existing building code and the seismic evaluation, are there prescriptive solutions, or does my engineer have to go in and do a full analysis as if it was a new building? You haven't mentioned anything about hold downs. You talked about plywood and you're making it all sound very easy and inexpensive, to be honest. But is there a requirement for hold downs? Or is it up to the engineer to analyze this just like any other new building? Or are there kind of some prescriptive methods that aren't quite as onerous?
Well, thank you for your question, and neither Michelle or I are engineers, and I don't want to try to, it's a great question. I'd like to get you in touch with people that can answer that question more accurately than Michelle and I could do it this evening. So maybe if you could put an email address or something in the chat, or I think Michelle has your contact information already, we'll be in touch and connect you with someone who can answer those questions specifically.
Okay, thank you.
It is a good note for everyone. We talked about the retrofits, and the building owner won't have to worry about this too much, but we do, like Colin said, have those specific requirements for the standards that the retrofit has to meet. And we will be putting some more information about that online as we get more into that phase of the program, but it will be important for the contractor to know what those requirements are. So, okay, we've got a few more here in the chat. Got a question. I suspect that the building I manage has a wood frame target story, but I need to submit the form and arrange a screening. How do I do that? So the basic way, as I mentioned before, is to get in touch with a licensed architect or engineer. Like Jeff was saying earlier, going onto our website and looking at that list, doing some research, calling around with other building owners finding somebody that you trust to help you with that process. And really it's about scheduling a time with that engineer or architect that you find for them to come out and inspect the building in person and help you fill out that form. So really, that's the main thing that you need to do. And then once that form is completed, you can submit it to us, again, either in mail, email, or in the online version. Okay, another question is, what is the consequence if I fail to meet the requirement in a timely way? This is a great question. It's a little bit, it depends a little bit. In terms of the deadlines, we have already passed the screening deadline, as I mentioned, and all of those buildings that haven't been screened, we've placed into Tier 1. The reason we've done that is basically, if you haven't told us otherwise, we're going to assume that you need a retrofit as soon as possible. But again, we want to make sure that all the buildings are eventually ending up in their correct tier or exempt if they are truly exempt. And so essentially, as we move towards that permit deadline for Tier 1, which is October 15th of next year, once we get to that point, if you haven't shown us otherwise with a screening form that you're exempt, we'll expect you to have a permit, and we start getting into compliance issues. But we really hope that we can get everybody done with their screening in the next few months so we don't get up to that point. One other thing that does come into this before that time is that we are required by the ordinance to publish a list of the buildings that are subject to this ordinance. That's something for maybe a buyer or a tenant who's interested in living in or buying the building. It's important information for them to know. So if your building doesn't belong on that list, you want to complete the screening so that you don't end up on there unnecessarily. So that's kind of the earliest consequence. And then the farther we get past that deadline, those consequences do stack up. I'll let Jeff get into that more.
Right, and ultimately, the big consequence is when an earthquake comes along, the building might be damaged, and the value of that asset will decline significantly, and your tenants will be displaced. In terms of the bureaucratic process, ultimately, we will record a notice with the county recorder on the property to indicate that it does not comply. And that's a basic notice requirement to ensure that a buyer is fully aware of what they're purchasing. So we don't want to do that. We understand the consequences to doing something like that. But that ultimately is one of the hammers that the city does have. We're not into this to charge fines and all that kind of stuff. We will do it. We can do it if we have to, but we're really, really trying to approach this from a collaborative process and work together to make these buildings sustainable for the long term. I will add, and nobody's asked, I don't know if we've got a grant question yet.
Yeah, we just got one. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll wait for that.
Yeah, does the city have any funding available to help owners conduct retrofits? You want to go ahead?
Okay, so the city, no. But we are expecting that the California Earthquake Authority will be coming out with a program, hopefully sometime in early next year. We don't know what the details are, but once we get those details, we'll make sure to communicate it to everyone. And if there's something about our program that we need to adjust to make sure that everybody possible is eligible for that program and the time frame works and so on and so forth, we will make adjustments. So we're cautiously optimistic that there's something out there that will work for us. Many of those programs are very competitive, so when you do hear from us about that, make sure you act quickly if there's some action required, because those funds usually get gobbled up. A lot of cities are doing, Los Angeles, we'd be competing against Los Angeles, probably San Jose, other cities that are gearing up these programs as well. So we'll try to get that grant program in everybody's hands as quickly as possible.
Thanks. Okay, this is jumping back a little bit. We got a question, is there any public listing for the subject buildings potentially available to the public? Which I mentioned a little bit. We will be posting a list of subject buildings in the future. There isn't one available right now. on that. Yeah, so coming soon. Let's see, we also got one. Can I ask the same engineer who inspected the building for SB 721, the 3E program, to sign this form since he's already familiar with the building? The answer is yes, you can. That engineer may or may not be comfortable doing it. They may or may not know about soft-story buildings, but if they are and they're already familiar with the building, that might be a great solution. So feel free to ask. Okay, let's see. We got a comment, someone who says he's designed soft-story retrofits for 15 years, and he thinks that 1 or 2 weeks for a tenant needing to relocate is very optimistic. So you might know more than us. We haven't done these, obviously, and I think it does depend on the building. From what we've heard from our consultant, it's pretty uncommon, but I'm sure there will be cases where it's a bigger hassle, so. And another comment, this one from our consultant, in fact, it would just be helpful and maybe hopeful to know that there are many, many design professionals and contractors in the area that are familiar with soft-story buildings and the specific code requirements we have for the retrofit, because this same type of program has already been done in San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley. So there are a lot of professionals in the area that have been working on buildings around here. A lot of those buildings are now finished, so there's some experienced folks who can help us here in Albany. Okay, that was all of the open questions so far. Anyone else? Questions? You can raise your hand again. You can type it in the chat.
Well, while you're doing that, maybe I'll mention just this 3E program that we've mentioned. So this is exterior elevated elements. This is a state law. If you'll recall, perhaps if you're in the area a few years ago, there was a tragedy in Berkeley where a balcony collapsed and some young people passed away. So the state law now requires that if you have 3 or more units, that the exterior portions of the building need to be inspected for essentially for dry rot. It's probably the same building that has a soft story feature might very well have this kind of a feature, but they're 2 completely different programs. The inspections for the 3E, the balconies and so forth, that can be done by licensed architects, licensed engineers, a building inspector, other than building inspectors in Albany, or building contractors. So it's a little bit easier to get people in to do the inspection. There's kind of a complicated timeline for conducting the inspection and submitting the results. The city has a relatively small role in it, and that the results, if there is a problem with the property, the results need to be sent to us, but we're not otherwise. We sent out a letter to property owners, but we're not otherwise managing these inspections like we are for the soft story. The important thing to know about this that's changed recently, the deadline was to be January 1st of 2025 for these inspections, and the state legislature changed that to January 1st, 2026. So I gave you an extra year, but again, if you have an unsafe building, an extra year is not such a good idea to leave it sitting for a dangerous situation, sitting for an extra year. Plus, people are going to be, the people who will be conducting those inspections will be pretty busy as the deadline approaches. So we're encouraging everybody to go out and get those inspections done sooner rather than later. And again, on our webpage, there's a handout, there's the form that could be submitted, and that's pretty straightforward. And if you have any questions about that, just send us an email or give us a call. Anything?
Not right now. Last call. And again, you can always email us with more questions that come up. Oh, here we go. This is a 3E question. I turned my 3E inspection letter into your office. Was I supposed to send it somewhere else?
No. I'm assuming that if it says that work is required, there's some timeframes to get that work completed. If it passed without any problems identified, then you're done.
Right. Yeah, and I know a lot of folks thought they were done with everything, and then they got this soft story letter, and they said, wait a second, what? So chances are that, if it seemed like your 3E issue was resolved, then it's just the soft story one left. Yeah, and so like I said, you can reach us. We have a website with a URL specific to the soft story program and an email. They're both on the letter that we sent you. But the address for the website is albanyca.org/softstory, and the email address is softstory@albanyca.org. So, we're happy to answer any questions you have, and you can also just give us a call. This will be recorded and posted online for your future reference. And yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you for coming in and being here online.
Yeah.
We had, I don't know, about 15, 20 people online?
Yeah, we've got 15, so yeah. We're just sad you guys weren't here in person to get the cookies.
Yeah, I bought a bunch of cookies. Oh,
Thanks again, everyone, and have a great night.
all right.